You watch others effortlessly climb to positions of power, while your honest efforts go unnoticed and unrewarded. Every day you play by the rules, deliver results, and maintain your integrity. Yet somehow you remain invisible when real opportunities for influence arise, while others seem to possess an almost supernatural ability to gain authority and command respect. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, the Renaissance political theorist who spent my life studying how power actually works, not how we wish it worked, but how it truly operates in the shadows of courts, governments, and organizations. For over 500 years, leaders have used the principles I discovered to gain and maintain power, even when the odds were stacked against them. What I learned about the secret weapon of effective rule will transform how you navigate any hierarchy, giving you the tools to build genuine influence and authority that others will respect and follow. The same strategies that guided princes and presidents can guide anyone who seeks to lead with both effectiveness and integrity in today's world. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless political wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to understand how power truly works. You must understand that I was not born understanding these truths about power. Like many idealistic young men, I once believed that virtue alone would triumph, that good intentions were sufficient for good governance, and that the righteous would naturally rise to lead, while the corrupt would fall under the weight of their own wickedness. How wrong I was. My awakening began in 1498, when I entered the service of the Florentine Republic as second chancellor. I was 29 years old, filled with humanist ideals and republican fervor. I believed deeply in the power of reason, the nobility of civic duty, and the ultimate victory of justice. The Florence I served was a beacon of Renaissance enlightenment. Yet beneath its cultural brilliance lay a seething cauldron of political intrigue that would shatter my naive assumptions forever. I witnessed firsthand the fall of Girolamo, the Dominican friar who had ruled Florence through moral authority and religious fervor. Savonarola was, by any measure, a man of genuine virtue. He lived simply, preached against corruption, and inspired thousands to burn their vanities in pursuit of spiritual purity. Yet for all his moral righteousness, for all his popular support, for all his undeniable sincerity, he was outmaneuvered by Pope Alexander VI, a man whose personal life was a scandal, whose children were born of concubinage, and whose political machinations were the stuff of legend. The Pope excommunicated Savonarola, turned his allies against him, and orchestrated his downfall with surgical precision. I watched as this holy man, beloved by the people, was arrested, tortured, and executed in the very square where he had preached reform. The crowds who had once hung on his every word now jeered at his suffering. In that moment, staring at Savonarola's burning body, I understood my first crucial lesson about power. Moral authority without political skill is not just ineffective, it is dangerous to those who possess it. But the education was far from over. Within months of Savonarola's death, I observed the return of the Medici family to prominence. The Medici had been banished from Florence, their vast wealth and influence seemingly broken forever. Yet they understood something, that Savonarola had not. That power flows not from righteousness, but from the careful cultivation of relationships, the strategic use of resources, and the patience to wait for fortune's wheel to turn in their favor. Cosimo de' Medici had not been the most virtuous man in Florence, but he had been the most astute. He had built networks of obligation through strategic loans and favors. He had cultivated allies in every major family. He had understood that in politics, gratitude is a currency more valuable than gold, and fear is more reliable than love. When opportunity presented itself, when Florence faced external threats and internal chaos, the city turned not to its most virtuous citizens, but to those who had proven their ability to navigate crisis and deliver results. This realization hit me like a physical blow. Everything I had been taught about leadership, everything I believed about justice and merit, crumbled before the evidence of my own eyes. The good did not inherently triumph. The pure of heart did not naturally rise to positions of influence. Instead, those who understood the mechanics of power, who could adapt their methods to circumstances, who could be both lion and fox as situations demanded these, were the ones who shaped the destiny of nations. My true education in the nature of power began when I was sent as an envoy to the court of Caesar Borgia in 1502. If Savonarola had taught me that virtue without skill is powerless, Borgia would teach me that skill without conscience could reshape the world. I approached this mission with considerable trepidation. The name Borgia was already synonymous with scandal, ambition, and ruthless efficiency throughout Italy. Cesare Borgia was 27 years old when I first encountered him. The illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, and already the most feared military commander in Italy. What struck me immediately was not his cruelty, as I had expected, but his calculated precision. Every action, every decision, every gesture was measured against a larger strategic purpose. He was not a monster driven by bloodlust, but an architect of power who understood that sometimes violence serves peace, and that decisive action prevents greater suffering. I watched him consolidate control over the Romagna region through a masterful combination of force and diplomacy. When he encountered resistance from local strongmen who would terrorize their subjects for generations, Borgia did not hesitate to eliminate them. But here was the crucial lesson. He did so in a way that increased rather than diminished his popular support. The people of these territories had suffered under petty tyrants for decades. When Borgia removed these oppressors, he was seen not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The most instructive example came in the city of Cesena, where Borgia had appointed Ramiro de Orco as his governor. De Orco was efficient but brutal, quickly establishing order through harsh measures that terrorized both criminals and citizens alike. The region became peaceful and prosperous, but the people grew to hate de Orco's methods. At this point, a lesser leader might have either defended his governor or gradually replaced him, sending mixed signals about his intentions. Borgia chose a third path that demonstrated his genius for political theater. On Christmas morning 1502, the people of Cesena awoke to find de Orco's body cut in half and displayed in the town square, with a bloody knife beside it. The message was unmistakable. Had heard their complaints and delivered justice. The brutal governor who had served his purpose was eliminated precisely when his brutality had become a liability rather than an asset. I must confess, my initial reaction was horror. The calculated nature of this execution, the cold precision with which Borgia had eliminated a loyal servant, seemed to represent everything wrong with political power. Yet, as I observed the reaction of the people, I began to understand the deeper wisdom in this terrible act. The citizens did not recoil in fear, they celebrated. They saw a ruler who listened to their concerns and acted decisively to address them. Borgia had transformed himself from a conquering general into a just prince in a single, dramatic gesture. This was my introduction to what I would later understand as the secret weapon of effective rule, the ability to adapt your methods to achieve your essential goals. Borgia's goal was not cruelty for its own sake, but the establishment of stable, just governance. When gentleness served that goal, he was gentle. When firmness was required, he was firm. When dramatic action was necessary to maintain his legitimacy, he provided drama. He was both lion and fox, adjusting his approach as circumstances demanded, but never losing sight of his ultimate objective. Through my months observing Borgia, I learned that the most effective leaders are not those who rigidly adhere to a single approach, but those who can read the needs of their moment and respond accordingly. The secret weapon is not any particular tactic, it is the wisdom to know which tactic the situation demands, and the courage to employ it regardless of conventional moral expectations. After years of observing rulers rise and fall, of witnessing the destruction of the virtuous and the triumph of the pragmatic, I can now reveal to you the secret weapon that separates effective leaders from failed idealists: adaptability, not the superficial flexibility of those who change with every wind, but the profound wisdom to vary your methods while maintaining unwavering commitment to your essential objectives. Most people misunderstand what I mean by adaptability. They imagine it means abandoning your principles or becoming unpredictable for its own sake. This is not adaptability, this is chaos. True adaptability requires the opposite: such clarity about your core mission that you can recognize when your current methods are hindering rather than advancing your goals, and the courage to change tactics while others cling to familiar failures. Consider the difference between a tree and a reed in a storm. The mighty oak, rigid and proud, snaps under pressure that the flexible reed survives by bending. Yet the reed does not abandon its nature, remains rooted. It continues to draw sustenance from the earth. It maintains its essential identity. It simply adjusts its posture to accommodate forces beyond its control. This is the adaptability that effective leaders must master. I have observed that most leaders fail not because they lack noble intentions or adequate resources, but because they become prisoners of their own methods. They develop strategies that work in particular circumstances, achieve some success, and then continue applying those same approaches long after conditions have changed. They mistake their tactics for their identity, their methods for their mission. Take the example of a military commander I knew who had achieved great victories through aggressive frontal assaults. His bold charges had broken enemy lines and earned him reputation and promotion. But when he faced an enemy that used his aggression against him, setting traps and ambushes that turned his strength into weakness, he could not adapt. Rather than changing his approach, he doubled down on the very tactics that were now failing him. His commitment to his method became stronger than his commitment to victory itself. The secret weapon of adaptability operates on 3 levels that every aspiring leader must master. First, you must develop what I call strategic patience, the ability to distinguish between temporary setbacks and fundamental changes in your environment. Not every obstacle requires a change in approach. Some require only persistence. But when the ground itself has shifted, when the rules of the game have changed, clinging to old methods becomes a form of suicide. Second, you must cultivate emotional detachment from your tactics. Your ego cannot become invested in being seen as consistent, predictable, or loyal to past approaches. I have watched leaders destroy themselves and their causes because admitting the need for change felt like admitting failure. They preferred noble defeat to pragmatic adaptation. This is pride masquerading as virtue. Third, you must develop the ability to read your environment with fresh eyes constantly. Most people see what they expect to see. Notice what confirms their existing beliefs and miss signals that contradict their assumptions. The adaptable leader practices what I call strategic skepticism, regularly questioning whether current conditions still warrant current methods. The adaptable leader is like a master craftsman who owns many tools but is enslaved by none. When the task requires a hammer, they use a hammer. When it requires a scalpel, they set aside the hammer without regret or self-recrimination. They understand that their identity lies not in their tools, but in their mastery of the craft itself. This is why I observed that Cesare Borgia could be both generous and ruthless, why successful merchants could be both trusting with reliable partners and suspicious with questionable ones, why effective parents could be both nurturing and firm depending on what their children needed in each moment. They had mastered the secret weapon of adaptability, the wisdom to let circumstances dictate methods, while never compromising on ultimate objectives. I have always maintained that fortune controls half of our actions, but that we ourselves control the other half. The leader who masters the secret weapon of adaptability must first master the art of reading fortune's signs, understanding when the winds of change are beginning to blow, and positioning themselves to ride those winds rather than be destroyed by them. In my years of diplomatic service, I learned to observe what others overlooked. While most courtiers focused on the obvious, the formal announcements, the public ceremonies, the explicit declarations of policy, trained myself to notice the subtle shifts that preceded major changes. The way alliances formed and dissolved often revealed itself first in the smallest social interactions, in who was invited to which dinners, in how long ministers spent in private conversation with their princes. I remember the months before the fall of Piero de' Medici in 1494. To most observers, Piero appeared secure in his power. He controlled Florence's finances, commanded its military, and bore one of the most respected names in Italy. Yet those who looked beneath the surface could see the erosion of his position months before it became apparent to everyone else. His supporters spoke of him with less enthusiasm. His enemies grew bolder in their criticisms, and most tellingly, the merchants began hedging their investments in ways that suggested they expected political instability. The wise leader develops what I call fortunesight, the ability to detect patterns before they become obvious to everyone else. This requires cultivating sources of information that go beyond official channels. I made it my practice to speak regularly with merchants, servants, soldiers, and clergy people who observed the powerful, but were not themselves invested in maintaining illusions about power's stability. Merchants, in particular, proved invaluable sources of intelligence. Their survival depends on accurately assessing political risk, so they develop keen instincts for detecting when regimes are beginning to weaken, when merchants begin quietly moving their assets, when they start demanding shorter terms on loans to political figures, when they begin cultivating relationships with potential successors. These are fortune's early warning signals that the astute leader learns to read. But reading fortune requires more than gathering information. It demands understanding the deeper currents that drive political change. I observed that most political upheavals follow predictable patterns. Success often contains the seeds of failure. As leaders who achieve great things begin to believe their own propaganda and lose touch with the conditions that made their success possible. I watched Julius II, one of the most successful popes in history, make this exact mistake. His military victories and diplomatic triumphs filled him with such confidence that he began to believe he could accomplish anything through force of will alone. He stopped listening to advisors who urged caution, dismissed intelligence that contradicted his optimistic assessments, and launched campaigns that his earlier, more prudent self would have recognized as overextensions of his resources. The leader who would master fortune must also understand that timing is everything in politics. The same action that succeeds brilliantly in one moment will fail catastrophically in another. I have seen identical reforms implemented by the same leaders achieve opposite results simply because they were attempted at different times in the political cycle. This is why successful leaders develop what I call strategic patience, the discipline to wait for the right moment, even when they have the power to act immediately. They understand that having the ability to do something is not the same as having the wisdom to know when to do it. Fortune favors not just the bold, but the bold who can read the signs of their times. The most sophisticated practitioners of fortune reading learn to create their own favorable moments. Rather than simply reacting to circumstances, they shape conditions to make their desired actions more likely to succeed. They understand that fortune is not entirely random, it responds to preparation, positioning, and careful cultivation of opportunity. I learned to think of fortune as a river that sometimes flows gently and sometimes floods with destructive force. The wise leader builds channels and dikes during calm periods, directing the flow in favorable directions and preparing for inevitable storms. When the floods come, they are ready to use fortune's power rather than be swept away by it. This preparation, this cultivation of fortune sight, becomes an essential component of the adaptable leader's arsenal. There comes a moment in every leader's journey when gentleness becomes weakness, when negotiation becomes appeasement, and when the only path forward requires the lion's strength. I have observed that many well-intentioned leaders destroy themselves and their causes because they cannot recognize when this moment has arrived, or because they lack the courage to act decisively when circumstances demand it. The art of knowing when to use force is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of effective leadership. Most people assume that force is either always wrong or always right, depending on their philosophical inclinations. This black and white thinking reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of leadership's responsibilities. The true question is not whether force is moral, but whether the failure to use force when necessary serves or undermines the greater good you are trying to achieve. I learned this lesson watching Francesco Soderini, the Gonfalonier of Florence, who possessed every virtue except the most crucial one, the willingness to act decisively when action was required. Soderini was learned, honest, well-intentioned, and genuinely devoted to the Republic's welfare. He sought consensus, respected due process, and treated even his enemies with courtesy and fairness. In peaceful times, these qualities made him an excellent leader. When Florence faced existential threats, these same qualities nearly destroyed the city. When the Medici family began organizing their return to power, gathering mercenary armies and building alliances with foreign powers, Soderini continued to treat them as legitimate political opponents rather than existential threats to the Republic. He allowed known Medici agents to operate freely within the city, permitted pro-Medici propaganda to circulate without response, and refused to take preemptive action against conspirators whose plans were known to his intelligence networks. Advisors begged him to arrest the key conspirators, to seize Medici assets before they could fund rebellion, to match their decisive action with equally decisive counteraction. He refused, believing that such measures would make him no better than a tyrant. His commitment to legal niceties prevented him from taking the very actions that could have preserved the legal system he was trying to protect. The result was predictable. When the Medici struck, they did so with overwhelming force coordinated with Spanish armies. Soderini's government collapsed within days, and many of the Republican institutions he had sought to preserve through his restraint were destroyed forever. His refusal to use force when it was necessary did not prevent violence, it simply ensured that when violence came, it would be used against, rather than by, those who might have wielded it more justly. This is the crucial insight about the lion's strength. Sometimes the use of force prevents greater force, just as sometimes a small war prevents a larger war. The leader who refuses to act decisively against clear threats often creates conditions that require far more devastating action later, usually by people with fewer scruples and less concern for justice. But understanding when to use force requires more than recognizing threats. It requires understanding the nature of your opposition. Some opponents can be negotiated with, compromised with, or converted into allies through patient diplomacy. Others view any attempt at accommodation as weakness to be exploited. The wise leader learns to distinguish between these types of opposition and adjusts their approach accordingly. I observed that adversaries generally fall into three categories. First are those who oppose your methods but share your fundamental objectives. These can often become allies if you address their legitimate concerns. Second are those who have conflicting interests but operate within accepted rules of engagements. These can be managed through negotiation and compromise. Third are those who reject the very framework within which you operate and seek your complete destruction. These require the lion's strength. The mistake most leaders make is treating all opposition as if it falls into the first two categories, applying negotiation and compromise tactics to adversaries who have already moved to open warfare. When someone has decided that your destruction is their objective, continued attempts at accommodation are not noble, they are suicidal. The effective use of force also requires understanding its psychological dimensions. Force is most effective when it is used decisively, overwhelmingly, and with clear justification that others can understand. Half measures that leave enemies wounded but not defeated create lasting resentment without eliminating threats. Arbitrary force that seems motivated by personal vendetta rather than legitimate necessity undermines the leader's moral authority and creates sympathy for their opponents. When Cesare Borgia eliminated the conspirators who had plotted against him at Sinigaglia, he did so completely and publicly, ensuring that potential future conspirators understood both the consequences of treachery and his determination to protect loyal followers. The force was proportional to the threat, justified by clear evidence of betrayal, and executed in a manner that strengthened rather than weakened his position with those who remained loyal. If the lion's strength teaches us when force is necessary, the fox's cunning reveals when intelligence can achieve what force cannot. I have observed that the most successful leaders are those who understand that many battles can be won through strategic presentation of information, careful timing of revelations, and the artful management of perceptions, rather than through direct confrontation. Let me be clear about what I mean by the fox's cunning, because this aspect of leadership is perhaps the most misunderstood. I am not advocating for pathological dishonesty or the kind of casual deception that destroys trust and undermines one's own credibility. Rather, I speak of the sophisticated understanding that truth itself is a tool that can be wielded skillfully or clumsily, and that the timing and manner of how information is presented often determines its impact more than the information itself. Learned this lesson while observing Pope Alexander VI navigate the complex web of European politics. Alexander faced a seemingly impossible situation. He needed to maintain alliances with France while appeasing Spain, support his son Caesar's territorial ambitions while reassuring threatened Italian cities, and preserve the Papal States' independence, while remaining vulnerable to any coalition of major powers. A lesser leader might have attempted to accomplish these contradictory objectives through force or through explicit negotiations that would have required him to choose sides and make enemies. Alexander chose the path of the fox. He became a master of what I call constructive ambiguity, allowing different parties to believe they understood his intentions while maintaining the flexibility to act as circumstances demanded. When French ambassadors sought assurance of his support against Spanish interests, Alexander would speak eloquently about the historic friendship between France and the Papal States, cite specific instances of French assistance to previous popes, and express his personal admiration for French culture and power. He never explicitly promised military support, but his manner and emphasis left the French convinced of his loyalty to their cause. Hours later, when Spanish representatives arrived seeking the same assurances, Alexander would demonstrate equal warmth while emphasizing different truths: the geographic reality of Spanish power in southern Italy, the shared Catholic mission of Spain and the Vatican, his concerns about French territorial ambitions. Again, no explicit commitments, but a clear impression of alignment. This was not simple duplicity. Alexander genuinely did value both relationships. and genuinely did face conflicting pressures that made exclusive loyalty to either side potentially disastrous. His fox-like approach allowed him to preserve maximum flexibility while circumstances clarified, avoiding premature commitments that might have proven catastrophic. The key insight here is that most situations contain multiple valid perspectives, and the skilled leader learns to emphasize the aspects of truth that serve their larger purposes without fabricating falsehoods that can be exposed and used against them. The fox's cunning lies not in lying, but in understanding that selective emphasis and strategic timing can shape how others interpret reality. I also observed the power of strategic silence. While most people feel compelled to fill conversational gaps and respond immediately to questions, the wise leader understands that silence itself communicates. When adversaries make accusations, sometimes the most powerful response is a long, thoughtful pause that forces them to elaborate and potentially reveal more than they intended. When allies seek commitments you are not ready to make, silence can preserve relationships without creating obligations. The fox's cunning also involves understanding the psychology of your audience and tailoring your message to their particular concerns and motivations. I watched successful diplomats present identical proposals to different parties using completely different arguments, emphasizing the aspects most likely to appeal to each audience's specific interests and values when seeking Venetian support. For a military alliance, a skilled ambassador would emphasize the commercial advantages and trading opportunities that would result from success. When approaching Florentine leaders, the same ambassador would focus on republican ideals and the threat posed by monarchical expansion. When courting papal support, the emphasis would shift to religious considerations and the protection of church interests. Each presentation was truthful, but each emphasized different facets of a complex reality. This is the fox's wisdom, understanding that truth has many faces, and that effective communication requires showing each audience the face they are most prepared to see and act upon. However, the fox's cunning requires careful limits. The leader who becomes too clever, who attempts to deceive everyone about everything, inevitably creates contradictions that expose their duplicity and destroy their credibility. The sustainable practice of strategic communication requires maintaining an underlying consistency of purpose, even while varying methods and presentations. The most sophisticated practitioners of the fox's cunning also understand the importance of occasionally revealing their strategic thinking to key allies, demonstrating that their apparent inconsistencies are actually evidence of deeper strategic planning rather than confusion or dishonesty. This builds trust with those whose support they most need while maintaining necessary flexibility with those who might exploit predictability. No leader, however skilled in the arts of the lion and the fox, can maintain power without genuine support from those they seek to lead. I have observed that many otherwise capable leaders destroy themselves by neglecting this fundamental truth, assuming that fear or formal authority alone can substitute for the deep loyalty that comes from shared interests and mutual benefit. The art of building a base of support requires understanding the difference between superficial compliance and genuine commitment. Superficial compliance is what you get when people follow orders because they fear the consequences of disobedience. This kind of support evaporates the moment your ability to enforce consequences is questioned. Genuine commitment is what you get when people believe that your success serves their own interests and values. This kind of support sustains you through temporary setbacks and even reinforces your position during challenges. I learned this distinction while studying the contrasting fates of two contemporaries, Louis XII of France and Ferdinand of Aragon. Both were skilled military commanders, both achieved significant territorial conquests, and both possessed considerable resources. Yet their approaches to building support led to dramatically different outcomes. Louis XII relied primarily on fear and formal authority. He conquered territories through superior military force, appointed governors who answered directly to him, and maintained control through the constant threat of punishment for disloyalty. This approach worked effectively in the short term. His territories remained peaceful and productive while his power was unquestioned. However, the moment his military position weakened, his entire system began to collapse. When Louis suffered defeats in Italy and faced rebellions in multiple territories simultaneously, he discovered that his governors had no loyalty beyond what his immediate power could enforce. Local populations, who had never benefited personally from his rule, provided no resistance to his enemies and often actively assisted them. His support structure, built entirely on fear, crumbled as soon as that fear was no longer credible. Ferdinand of Aragon took a different approach. While equally capable of using force when necessary, he invested enormous energy in creating networks of genuine mutual interest with key supporters. He understood that lasting power comes not from the ability to punish enemies, but from the ability to reward friends in ways that make them invested in your continued success. Ferdinand identified the most influential families in each region under his control and created opportunities for them to profit from collaboration with his administration. He appointed their members to prestigious positions, included them in profitable trading ventures, and consulted them on policies affecting their territories. These were not mere ceremonial gestures. He gave these allies real power and real benefits that they could only maintain as long as his regime survived. The result was that when Ferdinand faced military setbacks, his local allies had compelling reasons to remain loyal. They used their own resources to support his recovery, provided intelligence about his enemies' movements, and worked actively to maintain stability in their territories. His support base became self-reinforcing rather than self-undermining. The key insight here is that effective leaders understand they must create what I call communities of interest, groups of people whose personal success becomes tied to the leader's success. This requires moving beyond the simple transaction of obedience for protection to the more sophisticated dynamic of mutual investment in shared outcomes. Building such communities requires careful attention to the specific motivations and needs of different types of supporters. Military leaders want opportunities for glory and advancement. Merchants want stable conditions for trade and protection of their commercial interests. Intellectuals want recognition for their ideas and influence over policy. Religious leaders want respect for their spiritual authority and support for their institutional needs. The wise leader learns to speak each group's language and to structure relationships in ways that give each type of supporter compelling reasons to remain loyal. This is not mere manipulation. It is the recognition that sustainable leadership requires creating genuine value for those whose support you need. I also observed that the most effective base building involves what I call strategic vulnerability. Key supporters to see your humanity and your dependence on their loyalty. Leaders who try to appear invulnerable often fail to inspire the kind of personal devotion that sustains them through crises. Those who can show strength while acknowledging their need for others create deeper emotional bonds. However, building a support base also requires managing the inevitable tensions between different groups of supporters. Military supporters may want aggressive expansion, while merchant supporters prefer stable peace. Religious supporters may want strict moral policies, while political supporters prefer flexibility. The skilled leader learns to balance these competing demands without permanently alienating any crucial constituency. This balancing act requires what I call strategic sequencing of the needs of different support groups at different times in ways that maintain overall loyalty while preventing any single group from feeling permanently neglected. It also requires clear communication about the long-term vision that makes temporary sacrifices worthwhile for each group. Most importantly, Building genuine support requires delivering on promises made to key constituencies. The leader who consistently fails to reward loyalty will find that their support base gradually erodes, no matter how skilled they are in other areas of leadership. One of the most delicate aspects of maintaining power is dealing with those who actively oppose your leadership. The unskilled leader either ignores enemies until they become dangerous, or eliminates them in ways that create sympathy for their cause and inspire others to take up their banner. The master of political arts learns to neutralize opposition while avoiding the creation of martyrs, who become more powerful in death than they ever were in life. I witnessed this principle demonstrated most clearly in the contrasting approaches of two rulers dealing with similar threats. The first was Girolamo Riario, the Count of Forlock, who faced opposition from several prominent families who questioned his legitimacy and actively worked to undermine his authority. Riario's response was swift and brutal. He had the leaders of these families publicly executed in the town square, their properties confiscated, and their supporters banished. The immediate result appeared successful. Opposition activities ceased, potential conspirators were intimidated into silence, and Riario's authority seemed firmly established. However, within months, the families of those he had executed became symbols of resistance. Their deaths were commemorated in secret gatherings, their names invoked by new opponents, and their martyrdom provided emotional fuel for a broader rebellion that eventually cost Riario his throne and his life. Contrast this with the approach taken by Lorenzo de' Medici when faced with similar opposition in Florence. The Pazzi family and their allies had attempted to assassinate Lorenzo and seize control of the city. By any reasonable standard, Lorenzo would have been justified in executing all the conspirators and their supporters. Instead, he employed a strategy that neutralized the threat, while denying his enemies the power of martyrdom. Lorenzo did execute the immediate ringleaders, those whose direct involvement in the assassination attempt was undeniable and whose continued existence would have been seen as weakness. However, he treated the broader network of opponents with calculated mercy that served his strategic interests. Some were exiled rather than executed. Others were stripped of political power but allowed to maintain their commercial activities. And still others were offered opportunities to redeem themselves through loyal service. Most brilliantly, Lorenzo ensured that the narrative surrounding these events focused not on his victims' noble resistance to tyranny, but on their betrayal of Florence's prosperity and stability. He presented himself not as a ruler crushing dissent, but as a protector defending the city's welfare against selfish conspirators who would have plunged Florence into chaos for their personal ambitions. This approach had several crucial advantages. First, it demonstrated both strength and mercy, showing that Lorenzo was capable of decisive action when necessary, but preferred reconciliation when possible. Second, it divided his opposition by offering different fates to different levels of involvement, encouraging future opponents to consider whether their associates would prove as loyal to them as they were being asked to be to the cause. Third, it prevented the creation of a unified narrative of persecution that could inspire future resistance. The key insight here is that how you defeat your enemies matters as much as whether you defeat them. The goal is not merely to eliminate immediate threats, but to do so in ways that discourage the emergence of new threats. This requires thinking several moves ahead and considering not just the immediate tactical situation, but the longer-term strategic implications of your actions. I observed that the most effective method for neutralizing enemies involves what I call graduated response, matching the severity of your reaction to the actual level of threat posed, while always maintaining the option to escalate if necessary. This requires distinguishing between those who oppose your specific policies and those who reject your fundamental right to lead. Policy opponents can often be converted into allies by addressing their legitimate concerns or by demonstrating that your approach serves their underlying interests better than they initially understood. These individuals may disagree with your methods while sharing your basic objectives, and skilled leadership can transform such opposition into valuable counsel that improves your decision-making. Existential opponents, those who seek your removal from power regardless of your policies, require different treatment. However, even with these adversaries, the wise leader seeks to isolate them from potential sympathizers before taking decisive action. This isolation involves demonstrating that their opposition stems from personal ambition rather than principled disagreement, that their success would harm the very people they claim to represent, and that their methods are inconsistent with the values they profess to defend. The process of neutralizing enemies also requires careful attention to timing and presentation. Actions taken in apparent response to immediate threats are more easily justified than those that appear premeditated or vindictive. The leader who waits for enemies to reveal their hostile intentions through their own actions can respond with force while maintaining moral authority. Perhaps most importantly, the skilled leader understands that the goal of dealing with enemies is not personal satisfaction or revenge, but the preservation and strengthening of their ability to serve the greater good. Every action taken against opponents must be evaluated not by how it feels in the moment, but by how it affects your long-term capacity to lead effectively. This perspective requires emotional discipline that many leaders lack. The natural human response to opposition is anger, and the natural political response to threats is overwhelming retaliation. The master of political arts learns to subordinate these impulses to strategic calculation, asking not, "How can I punish my enemies?" but "How can I neutralize threats while strengthening my position and advancing my mission?" Power is not merely possessed, it must be performed. I have observed that many leaders who hold legitimate authority and command substantial resources fail because they do not understand that leadership is fundamentally a form of theater, and that how power appears to others often matters more than how much power actually exists. This insight came to me through watching the contrasting public presentations of two rulers with similar actual capabilities but vastly different outcomes. The first was Piero de' Medici, who inherited substantial wealth, strong family networks, and nominal control over Florence's government. The second was Cesare Borgia, who began with illegitimate birth, uncertain finances, and enemies on all sides. Yet Borgia projected such an aura of inevitable success that allies flocked to him, while Piero appeared so uncertain that supporters abandoned him even when his position was strong. Piero's fundamental error was believing that power was a private matter, that as long as he actually controlled resources and made sound decisions, public perception was irrelevant. He dressed modestly, spoke hesitantly in public forums, and often appeared to be seeking approval rather than providing direction. When faced with challenges, his natural tendency was to retreat into private consultation, leaving the public space to his critics and enemies. This approach might have worked in a different era, but in the complex political environment of Renaissance Italy, perception shaped reality with frightening speed. Piero's apparent uncertainty convinced potential allies that supporting him was risky, encouraged fence-sitters to hedge their bets, and emboldened opponents who might have remained quiet if faced with more confident leadership. Borgia understood that power is largely a confidence game. Those who appear destined for success attract the support that makes success possible, while those who appear vulnerable invite the challenges that make them vulnerable. He invested enormous energy in what we might call the dramaturgy of authority, the careful orchestration of public appearances designed to create and maintain an impression of inevitability. When Borgia entered a city, he did so with carefully choreographed ceremony that demonstrated both his military capability and his respect for local customs. His retinue was large enough to impress, but not so large as to threaten. His dress was rich enough to signal prosperity, but not so ostentatious as to suggest excess. His manner was confident enough to project authority, but gracious enough to suggest benevolent intentions. Every detail of these performances was calculated to produce specific psychological effects. The timing of his arrivals, the order in which he received various delegations, the symbolic gifts he presented to local leaders, the public pronouncements he made all were designed to reinforce the narrative that his success was inevitable, and that supporting him was both safe and profitable. But the performance of power extends far beyond grand ceremonial occasions. I observed that successful leaders understand that every interaction, every decision, every public statement contributes to their overall image of competence and authority. They develop what I call performative consistency, the ability to project confidence and control even when facing uncertainty or setbacks. This requires mastering several crucial skills. First is the management of emotional display. The leader, who appears rattled by criticism, surprised by opposition, or overwhelmed by responsibility, unconsciously invites others to question their capability. The skilled performer of power learns to maintain outward composure regardless of inner turmoil, understanding that their emotional state becomes a form of public information that allies and enemies alike will use to assess their strength. Second is the strategic use of symbolic action. I watched Pope Julius II transform his entire political position through a single dramatic gesture, personally leading the siege of Mirandola, despite his advanced age and the protests of his advisors. The military value of his presence was minimal, but the symbolic impact was enormous. His willingness to share the dangers faced by his soldiers demonstrated commitment that words alone could never convey, and his apparent fearlessness in the face of enemy fire projected an aura of divine protection that strengthened his authority throughout Italy. Third is the careful management of accessibility and mystery. Leaders must be visible enough to demonstrate their engagement and control, but not so available that they lose the aura of specialness that authority requires. I observed that the most effective rulers developed what I call strategic distance. They appeared at crucial moments with perfect timing, made their positions clear through decisive action, and then withdrew before familiarity could breed contempt. The performance of power also requires understanding your audience and adapting your presentation to their expectations and values. What projects strength to a military audience may appear crude to diplomatic observers. What demonstrates wisdom to intellectual advisors may seem indecisive to merchants who need quick answers to commercial questions. I watched successful leaders develop different performative personas for different contexts while maintaining underlying consistency of character. With soldiers, they emphasized courage and decisive action. With merchants, they stressed practical wisdom and profitable outcomes. With clergy, they highlighted moral purpose and spiritual authority. Yet underneath these variations, their core identity remained recognizable and authentic. Perhaps most importantly, the performance of power must be sustainable over time. Leaders who attempt to project capabilities they do not possess or values they do not hold will eventually be exposed by the inevitable crises that test all authority. The most effective performers of power learn to amplify and highlight their genuine strengths rather than fabricating fictional qualities. The key insight is that this performative aspect of leadership is not mere vanity or manipulation. It serves essential functions in maintaining the social order. People need to believe in their leaders' competence and authority in order to cooperate effectively with their directives. When leaders fail to project confidence and capability, they create uncertainty that undermines the very social cooperation. Their leadership is meant to coordinate, Understanding the performance of power also means recognizing when others are performing for your benefit and learning to distinguish between genuine capability and skillful presentation. The leader who can see through others' performances while perfecting their own possesses a crucial advantage in the complex theater of political life. The greatest danger to any leader comes not from distant enemies, but from those closest to them, advisors, administrators, and confidants, who have access to their most sensitive information and influence over their most crucial decisions. I have observed that more rulers are destroyed by treachery from within their inner circle than by all external threats combined. Yet most leaders pay far more attention to managing distant opponents than to carefully selecting and maintaining the loyalty of their closest associates. The fundamental challenge in managing an inner circle is what I call the loyalty competence paradox. The people most loyal to you are often those who owe their positions entirely to your favor, but these same people may lack the skills and judgment you need for effective decision-making. Conversely, the most competent advisors are often those with independent sources of power and influence, but their very independence makes their loyalty uncertain when your interests conflict with their own. I witnessed this paradox destroy Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, who surrounded himself with family members and long-time personal friends, whose loyalty was unquestionable, but whose abilities were insufficient for the complex challenges he faced. When French armies invaded Italy and Sforza needed sophisticated military and diplomatic counsel, his inner circle proved incapable of providing the strategic thinking his situation required. Their loyalty remained absolute even as their incompetence contributed to his downfall. Contrast this with the approach taken by Ferdinand of Aragon, who deliberately cultivated an inner circle that balanced personal loyalty with professional competence. Ferdinand identified individuals whose personal interests were aligned with his success, but who also possessed the skills necessary to advance those shared interests effectively. He understood that the most reliable loyalty comes not from personal affection or family obligation, but from the recognition that one's own prosperity depends on the leader's continued success. The key to building such an inner circle lies in what I call strategic selection, choosing advisors based not on personal comfort or emotional connection, but on their ability to contribute to your mission while having compelling reasons to remain loyal. This requires looking beyond obvious qualifications to understand each potential advisor's deeper motivations, alternative opportunities, and personal vulnerabilities. I learned to evaluate potential inner circle members using several crucial criteria. First, I assessed their competence, not just in their stated areas of expertise, but in the political skills necessary to function effectively in a leadership environment. Technical knowledge without political judgment often creates more problems than it solves, as brilliant individuals who cannot navigate power dynamics become sources of conflict rather than solutions. Second, I examined their alternative options. Advisors who could easily find comparable positions elsewhere are inherently less dependable than those whose careers are meaningfully advanced by their association with you. This does not mean choosing only desperate sycophants, but rather understanding that sustainable loyalty requires mutual dependence and benefit. Third, I considered their personal characters, particularly their capacity for discretion and their ability to subordinate personal ambition to collective goals. The inner circle member who leaks confidential information to enhance their own reputation, or who pursues personal advancement at the expense of the team's effectiveness, will ultimately undermine your position regardless of their other talents. Managing an inner circle also requires establishing clear protocols for decision-making that prevent the emergence of destructive rivalries and power struggles. I observed that many leaders fail because they allow their advisors to compete for influence in ways that create more conflict within the Hopi administration than exists with external opponents. The most effective approach involves what I call functional specialization, giving each inner circle member clear areas of primary responsibility while maintaining your own role as the final decision maker on all matters of strategic importance. This prevents the confusion and conflict that arise when multiple advisors attempt to influence the same decisions, while ensuring that each member has sufficient authority to feel valued and invested in outcomes. However, functional specialization must be balanced with what I call strategic overlap, ensuring that multiple advisors understand all major issues well enough to provide independent counsel and to serve as checks on each other's recommendations. The leader who becomes completely dependent on single advisors for particular types of decisions creates dangerous vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those advisors or by enemies who target them. Perhaps most crucially, managing an inner circle requires what I call calculated transparency, sharing enough information with advisors to enable effective counsel while maintaining enough privacy to preserve your independence and security. Advisors who know everything become potential threats to your autonomy, while those who know too little cannot provide useful guidance. The skilled leader learns to create what I call graduated access, different levels of confidential information available to different members of the inner circle based on their roles, their demonstrated trustworthiness, and the strategic value of their counsel. This approach maintains essential security while enabling the collaborative decision-making that complex leadership requires. Most importantly, managing an inner circle requires the emotional discipline to make personnel changes when circumstances demand them, even when such changes involve people to whom you feel personal loyalty or gratitude. The advisor who served well in one situation may be unsuited for new challenges, and the leader who cannot adapt their team to changing needs will find their entire organization becoming obsolete. The distribution of rewards and favors is one of the most powerful tools available to any leader, yet I have observed that most rulers use this tool poorly, either through excessive stinginess that alienates potential supporters or through indiscriminate generosity that devalues their gifts and bankrupts their resources. The master of political arts learns to give strategically, timing and targeting their largesse to maximize both immediate benefits and long-term influence. I learned this lesson by observing the contrasting approaches of two contemporaries who faced similar challenges but achieved dramatically different outcomes through their handling of generosity. The first was Charles VIII of France, who possessed enormous resources and genuine goodwill, but squandered both through poorly timed and badly targeted gift-giving that ultimately weakened rather than strengthened his position. Charles believed that generosity should flow from abundance, and since France was wealthy, he saw no reason to be calculating about his gifts. He distributed land grants, tax exemptions, and monetary rewards based primarily on personal affection and the immediate circumstances of his encounters with various nobles and officials. His generosity was genuine and often excessive, but it followed no strategic plan and served no larger political purpose. The results were counterproductive in several ways. First, Charles's unpredictable generosity created a court culture focused on gaining his personal favor rather than advancing French interests. Courtiers spent more energy positioning themselves for rewards than implementing effective policies. Second, his lack of clear criteria for receiving gifts meant that many deserving servants went unrewarded, while less deserving individuals received substantial benefits, creating resentment among those whose loyal service was taken for granted. Most damaging of all, Charles's excessive generosity in some areas forced him to be stingy in others, since even French resources were not unlimited. When he needed to fund military campaigns or respond to genuine emergencies, he found his treasury depleted by gifts that had produced no lasting political benefit. His generosity had become a weakness that his enemies could exploit by creating situations that required resources he no longer possessed. Contrast this with the approach taken by Isabella of Castile, who possessed fewer resources than Charles, but wielded them with precision that multiplied their impact. Isabella understood that the value of a gift depends not only on its material worth, but on its timing, its exclusivity, and its connection to the recipient's specific needs and desires. Isabella practiced what I call strategic scarcity, limiting her generosity to make each gift more meaningful and to ensure that receiving her favor was seen as a significant achievement rather than an entitlement. She studied the personal motivations of key individuals in her realm, learning what each person most desired and then providing exactly those rewards at moments when they would have maximum psychological and political impact. When a military commander achieved a significant victory, Isabella's rewards went beyond monetary compensation to include the specific forms of recognition that commander most valued, perhaps a hereditary title for his family, or permission to display royal arms, or a prominent role in court ceremonies. These personalized rewards cost relatively little, but created profound loyalty, because they demonstrated that the Queen understood and valued each individual's particular contributions and aspirations. Isabella also understood the importance of what I call performative generosity, giving in ways that not only benefited the immediate recipient, but also communicated important messages to broader audiences. When she rewarded loyal service publicly and ceremonially, she was not just compensating one individual, but teaching everyone who observed the ceremony about the kinds of behavior that earned royal favor. The strategic use of generosity also requires understanding the psychology of gratitude and obligation. I observed that gifts given at moments of recipient vulnerability or need create deeper loyalty than those given during times of prosperity and security. The person you help during their darkest hour becomes bound to you by bonds that mere monetary payment cannot create. However, generosity must be balanced with what I call strategic restraint. The wisdom to withhold rewards when giving them would send the wrong messages or create perverse incentives. I watched several leaders undermine their own authority by rewarding behavior they wanted to discourage, simply because they felt obligated to show appreciation for effort, regardless of results. The skilled leader learns to distinguish between effort and achievement, between good intentions and effective outcomes. Rewarding effort alone encourages ineffectiveness, while rewarding only results encourages reckless risk-taking. The optimal approach involves what I call graduated recognition, acknowledging effort, while reserving the highest rewards for actual achievement. Strategic restraint also means understanding when to let people demonstrate their loyalty through service, rather than undermining that loyalty through premature rewards. The advisor who is eager to prove their worth will often work harder and more creatively when their compensation is deferred than when it is provided immediately. Perhaps most importantly, the strategic use of generosity requires maintaining what I call reciprocal expectations, censuring that those who receive your favors understand that continued benefits depend on continued service. Gifts should create obligation, not entitlement. The recipient should leave each interaction feeling grateful for what they have received while understanding that future rewards depend on future performance. This approach requires careful communication that emphasizes the conditional nature of your generosity without appearing transactional or cold. The art lies in making people feel valued and appreciated while maintaining their incentive to continue earning your favor through excellent service. The wise leader treats the failures of their predecessors as a library of cautionary tales, studying not just what went wrong, but why it went wrong and how similar mistakes can be avoided. I have made it my practice to examine the downfall of every ruler whose story I could learn, seeking patterns in their errors that might inform my own understanding of powers, pitfalls, and falsibilities. The most instructive failures are often those of leaders who possessed genuine talents and achieved significant successes before their ultimate destruction. These cases reveal that competence alone is insufficient for sustained leadership, and that even skilled rulers can be undone by predictable mistakes that careful study might have helped them avoid. Consider the case of Girolamo Savonarola, whose rise and fall provided me with crucial insights about the relationship between moral authority and political sustainability. Savonarola possessed extraordinary gifts. He was genuinely virtuous, intellectually brilliant, and capable of inspiring profound devotion in his followers. His sermons drew enormous crowds, his reforms eliminated corruption, and his influence extended far beyond Florence to shape political and religious thought throughout Italy. Yet for all his remarkable abilities, Savonarola made fundamental errors that made his destruction inevitable. His first mistake was believing that moral authority could substitute for political skill. He assumed that because his cause was just and his intentions pure, he could ignore the practical requirements of building and maintaining coalitions. He treated political opposition as moral failing rather than strategic challenge, and responded to criticism with religious condemnation rather than tactical adaptation. Savonarola's second fatal error was expanding his conflicts unnecessarily, rather than consolidating his position in Florence and building from that secure base. He chose to challenge Pope Alexander VI directly, making enemies of powerful interests that had no immediate quarrel with his local reforms. He transformed manageable local opposition into existential conflict with forces far beyond his capacity to defeat. Most instructively, Savonarola failed to prepare for the inevitable moment when popular enthusiasm would wane. He built his entire political position on the emotional fervor of his supporters, but made no institutional arrangements to maintain his influence when that fervor cooled. When external pressures mounted and immediate results failed to match grandiose promises, his support evaporated with shocking speed. These patterns, substituting moral certainty for political wisdom, expanding conflicts beyond necessary scope, and failing to institutionalize temporary advantages, appear repeatedly in the stories of failed leaders across centuries and cultures. Understanding these patterns allows current leaders to recognize when they are approaching similar dangers. Another instructive failure was that of Piero de' Medici, who inherited one of the strongest political positions in Italy, but destroyed it through errors that seem obvious in retrospect. Piero's fundamental mistake was assuming that inherited authority would automatically command the same respect that his ancestors had earned through their achievements. He acted with the confidence of established power while lacking the skills that had created that power. Piero failed to understand that each generation of leaders must prove themselves anew to their constituents. The loyalty his father had earned through decades of wise governance did not automatically transfer to him. Instead of working to build his own relationships and demonstrate his own competence, Piero relied on formal position and family reputation while his actual influence steadily eroded. When crisis came in the form of French invasion, Piero's weaknesses were exposed catastrophically. He had no deep relationships with key supporters who might have sustained him through difficulty. He had not developed the judgment necessary to navigate complex military and diplomatic challenges. Most fatally, he had not earned the kind of personal loyalty that might have motivated others to take risks on his behalf. The pattern here assuming that formal authority equals actual influence, neglecting relationship maintenance, and failing to develop crisis management skills represents another common path to leadership failure that careful observation might have helped Piero avoid. I also studied the failure of Louis XII of France, whose downfall illustrated the dangers of overextension and strategic impatience. Louis possessed substantial resources and achieved impressive military victories, but he could not resist the temptation to pursue every available opportunity, regardless of whether his position could sustain such ambitious undertakings. Louis's error was mistaking tactical success for strategic wisdom. Each of his military victories convinced him that greater victories were possible, leading him to commit to increasingly complex and demanding campaigns that ultimately exceeded his capacity to manage effectively. He became trapped in a cycle where each success required even greater commitment to maintain, until he was fighting on too many fronts with insufficient resources. The lesson here is that success itself can become a source of failure when it generates overconfidence and clouds judgment about sustainable limits. The leader who cannot say no to attractive opportunities will eventually find themselves committed to more than they can accomplish effectively. Perhaps most importantly, studying these failures revealed to me that most leadership disasters are not caused by external forces or unforeseeable circumstances, but by predictable human weaknesses that compound over time. Pride, impatience, the inability to adapt to changing circumstances, neglect of key relationships, overestimation of one's own capabilities. These are the real enemies of sustained leadership. The leader who studies these patterns and remains vigilant against them in their own behavior gains enormous advantages over those who assume their good intentions and initial successes will protect them from similar fates. History is not destiny, but it is instruction for those wise enough to learn from others' mistakes rather than insisting on making all of them personally. Every leader will face moments of severe testing when their authority is questioned, their resources are strained, and their very survival depends on decisions made under extreme pressure. I have observed that what separates successful leaders from those who are destroyed by crisis is not the absence of challenges, but the quality of their preparation for challenges they know must eventually come. The fundamental insight about preparing for crisis is that it must be done during times of strength and stability, when you have the luxury of careful planning and resource accumulation. The leader who waits until crisis arrives to begin preparing will find their options severely limited and their capacity for effective response compromised by the immediate pressures they face. I learned this lesson through my own experience during the crisis that ended my career in government. In 1512, when the Medici returned to power in Florence and my Republican government fell, I found myself completely unprepared for the personal and professional catastrophe that followed. I had served faithfully for 14 years, had developed what I believed was expertise in political affairs, and had assumed that my competence and dedication would protect me from arbitrary persecution. I was wrong on all counts. When political winds shifted, my years of service became liabilities rather than assets. My knowledge of Republican governance made me a threat to the new monarchical order. My network of relationships with foreign governments made me suspect of treasonous activities. My very competence became evidence that I was too dangerous to leave at liberty. The torture I endured and the exile that followed taught me that competence and loyalty provide no protection against political upheaval. Only careful preparation for worst-case scenarios can preserve your capacity to survive and eventually rebuild when fortune turns against you. This preparation must occur across multiple dimensions for social, informational, and psychological. Financial preparation requires what I call strategic reserves, resources set aside specifically for times when your regular income sources may be compromised or eliminated. These reserves must be substantial enough to sustain you through extended periods of reduced circumstances, and they must be positioned where they cannot be easily confiscated by hostile authorities. The leader who lives at the full extent of their current income, regardless of how substantial that income may be, creates dangerous vulnerabilities. I observed successful leaders who quietly maintained assets in multiple locations, cultivated relationships with merchant networks that could provide emergency financing, and developed skills that could generate income independent of their political positions. They understood that political authority is always temporary, and that wise leaders prepare for life after power while they still possess the influence to make such preparations effectively. Social preparation involves cultivating relationships that can survive political upheaval. The connections that seem most valuable during times of success, relationships with other powerful officials, dependencies based on mutual advantage, alliances rooted in shared political objectives often evaporate when circumstances change. More durable are the personal bonds formed through genuine mutual respect, shared experiences of hardship, and commitments that transcend immediate political considerations. I learned to distinguish between fair weather allies and true friends through careful observation of how people behaved during minor crises. Those who remained loyal when supporting you carried small costs, were likely to remain loyal when the costs became significant. Those who distanced themselves at the first sign of controversy would certainly abandon you when abandonment became fashionable or necessary for their own survival. Informational preparation requires developing sources of intelligence that operate independently of your official position. The leader who relies entirely on formal channels for information about potential threats will often be surprised by developments that careful observation might have detected in advance. Private networks of information gathering become crucial when official sources may be compromised or when your access to official information is eliminated. This means cultivating relationships with people who observe political developments from different perspectives, merchants who track economic trends, clergy who monitor social movements, soldiers who understand military capabilities, intellectuals who analyze long-term patterns. These diverse sources provide early warning of changes that might affect your position and opportunities to adapt before problems become crises. Perhaps most importantly, preparing for inevitable challenges requires psychological conditioning, the mental resilience to function effectively under extreme stress, and the emotional detachment necessary to make sound decisions when personal stakes are highest. I observed that many otherwise capable leaders were destroyed not by the objective severity of their challenges, but by their inability to think clearly when everything they had worked for was at risk. Psychological preparation involves what I call scenario planning, mentally rehearsing potential crisis situations and developing provisional responses before emotions and time pressure complicate decisions. The leader who has already considered how they would respond to various forms of betrayal, opposition, or resource loss will react more effectively when such situations actually arise. This preparation also requires developing what I call strategic stoicism, the ability to accept losses and setbacks as inevitable features of political life, rather than personal catastrophes that compromise your judgment. The leader who cannot lose gracefully will often compound initial setbacks through desperate actions that transform manageable problems into existential threats. Most crucially, preparing for challenges requires building systems and institutions that can function effectively even when your personal leadership is compromised. The leader whose entire organization depends on their direct involvement creates vulnerabilities that enemies can exploit by targeting them personally. Those who develop capable subordinates, clear operational procedures, and institutional memory that transcends individual personalities create more resilient foundations for their work. The principles I've discovered in the courts and battlefields of Renaissance Italy apply with remarkable precision to the leadership challenges of modern organizations. Though the specific tactics must be adapted to contemporary contexts and expectations, today's corporate hierarchies, government bureaucracies, and non-profit institutions operate according to the same fundamental dynamics of power that shaped the political landscape of my era. but they require more subtle applications of timeless strategies. The modern leader faces what I call the democracy paradox. They must exercise authority in environments that officially celebrate collaboration and consensus. Yet decisions still require someone willing to take responsibility and provide direction when groups cannot reach agreement. This creates unique challenges for those who would apply the lion's strength and the fox's cunning in contexts where direct displays of force are unacceptable and obvious manipulation is professionally suicidal. I have observed through careful study of contemporary leadership that the most successful modern practitioners adapt my principles through what I call democratic authoritarianism. They build consensus when possible and make unilateral decisions when necessary, but they do so in ways that preserve the illusion of collaborative decision. They understand that modern followers need to feel consulted and respected even when they are ultimately being directed. The modern equivalent of military conquest is what business leaders call market capture or organizational transformation. Like territorial expansion in my era, these undertakings require the same careful balance of force and diplomacy, the same attention to timing and resource management, and the same ability to adapt tactics to unexpected resistance. The executive who attempts to transform organizational culture through pure mandate will fail as surely as the prince who attempts to conquer territory through force alone. Instead, successful organizational transformation requires the modern version of strategic alliance building. The transformational leader must identify key influencers within the existing culture, understand their motivations and concerns, and create opportunities for them to become invested in the change process. This is precisely what successful military commanders did when conquering new territories. They found ways to make local leaders partners in the new order rather than permanent opponents of it. The corporate environment also requires mastering what I call bureaucratic navigation, understanding how formal organizational structures interact with informal power networks, to determine how decisions actually get made and implemented. In many modern organizations, the official hierarchy bears little resemblance to the actual influence patterns that determine outcomes. I have studied leaders who failed because they focused exclusively on managing up to their official superiors, while neglecting the lateral relationships and subordinate loyalty that actually determined their capacity to execute their responsibilities. They possessed formal authority but lacked practical influence, much like ceremonial kings who held impressive titles, while real power resided elsewhere. The most sophisticated modern practitioners understand that influence in contemporary organizations requires what I call multidirectional relationship management. They must simultaneously manage their relationships with superiors who control their advancement, peers who can either support or undermine their initiatives, and subordinates whose cooperation determines their effectiveness. Each relationship requires different tactics and appeals to different motivations with superiors. The modern leader must project competence and reliability while carefully managing their superiors' ego and insecurities. This requires the fox's cunning in presenting information and recommendations in ways that allow superiors to feel that good ideas originated with them, while ensuring that responsibility for failures can be appropriately distributed with peers. The challenge is building collaborative relationships while competing for limited resources and advancement opportunities. This requires what I call competitive cooperation, the ability to work together effectively on shared objectives while positioning yourself advantageously for individual recognition and promotion. With subordinates, modern leadership requires inspiring voluntary commitment in people who have numerous alternative employment options and who cannot be compelled through fear of physical punishment. This demands more sophisticated applications of the principles I observed in successful Renaissance rulers, creating genuine mutual benefit, demonstrating personal investment in followers' success, and building cultures where individual achievement serves collective goals. The modern leader must also master what I call reputational warfare, the contemporary equivalent of military conflict, in which competitors attempt to damage each other's credibility and standing rather than their physical assets. Social media, professional networks, and 24-hour news cycles create environments where reputation can be built or destroyed with unprecedented speed, requiring constant vigilance and strategic communication. Perhaps most significantly, modern organizational leadership requires understanding how to exercise power in environments with multiple stakeholders who possess different types of influence over your success. The corporate executive must manage not only employees and superiors, but also customers, regulators, shareholders, media representatives, and community leaders. Each group operates according to different rules and responds to different incentives. This creates what I call the transparency challenge. Modern leaders must be more open about their decision-making processes while maintaining the strategic privacy necessary for effective planning and negotiation. They must appear authentic and accessible while preserving the mystique that authority requires. They must build trust through consistency while maintaining the flexibility that changing circumstances demand. The successful modern practitioner of these principles understands that the fundamental goal remains the same as it was in my era: building and maintaining the capacity to advance worthy objectives despite opposition and obstacles. The specific tactics may involve emails rather than armies, performance reviews rather than public executions, and strategic partnerships rather than military alliances. But the underlying dynamics of power, influence, and human motivation remain remarkably constant across centuries. The skills required to gain power are fundamentally different from those needed to maintain it. Yet I have observed that most leaders fail to make this crucial transition. They continue applying the tactics that brought them to authority long after those tactics have become inappropriate or counterproductive, and they are surprised when their position begins to erode despite their continued efforts to do what previously worked so well. The aspiring leader must focus primarily on distinguishing themselves from competitors, demonstrating their superiority over alternatives, and building coalitions powerful enough to overcome existing arrangements. These activities require what I call insurgent virtues: boldness, innovation, the willingness to challenge established ways of doing things, and the ability to promise better outcomes than current leadership provides. However, once authority is achieved, these same qualities can become liabilities. The established leader who continues to act like an insurgent creates unnecessary instability and signals to followers that their position remains uncertain. People need to believe that their leader's authority is secure and legitimate in order to invest fully in supporting their initiatives and accepting their direction. The transition from gaining power to maintaining it requires mastering what I call incumbent virtues: consistency, reliability, institutional respect, and the ability to manage expectations rather than constantly raising them. The successful incumbent leader understands that their primary task shifts from proving they deserve power to demonstrating that they can exercise power responsibly and effectively. I learned this lesson through observing the contrasting approaches of two rulers who achieved similar initial success but diverged dramatically in their long-term outcomes. The first was Cesare Borgia, whose tactical brilliance in conquering the Romagna region I have previously described. Borgia's methods were perfectly suited to the challenge of establishing authority in hostile territory against determined opposition. However, when circumstances changed and Borgia needed to consolidate his gains rather than continue expanding, he struggled to adapt his approach. He continued to rely on dramatic gestures and shocking displays of force when what his subjects needed was predictable governance and stable institutions. His failure to transition from conquest mode to administration mode ultimately contributed to his downfall when external pressures mounted and he needed sustainable internal support. Contrast this with Ferdinand of Aragon, who demonstrated remarkable ability to adjust his leadership style as his circumstances evolved. During his rise to power, Ferdinand was bold, innovative, and willing to take enormous risks to achieve his objectives. Once established, however, he became increasingly systematic, building institutional frameworks that could outlast his personal involvement in creating predictable processes that allowed his subjects to plan their own activities around stable expectations. Ferdinand understood that maintaining power requires what I call strategic conservatism, the wisdom to preserve and strengthen what works, rather than constantly seeking dramatic changes that might destabilize beneficial arrangements. This does not mean avoiding all innovation, but rather being much more selective about when and how to introduce changes. The established leader must also learn to manage what I call the success trap, the tendency for achievements to create new expectations and pressures that can be more difficult to satisfy than the original challenges that brought you to power. Initial success often raises stakeholder expectations to unsustainable levels, creating situations where continued success is measured against increasingly demanding standards. I observed this dynamic destroy several capable leaders who failed to understand that their early achievements had fundamentally changed the context in which their subsequent performance would be evaluated. They continued to measure their success against the previous circumstances, rather than recognizing that their elevated position required them to meet entirely different standards. Maintaining power also requires developing what I call institutional thinking, the ability to build systems and processes that reduce dependence on your personal involvement in routine decisions. The leader who cannot delegate effectively becomes trapped by the very success of their organization, as growing responsibilities exceed any individual's capacity for direct management. This transition requires overcoming the control impulses that often contribute to initial success. The aspiring leader typically succeeds by being more involved, more decisive, and more hands-on than their competitors. The established leader must learn when this intensive personal involvement becomes a bottleneck that prevents further growth and development. Perhaps most crucially, maintaining power requires managing the inevitable emergence of new challengers who will use against you the same tactics you once used against your predecessors. The established leader must develop what I call competitive resilience, the ability to respond effectively to insurgent challenges without abandoning the incumbent virtues that sustain your current position. This creates what I call the renewal paradox. You must be stable enough to provide the consistency that incumbency requires, yet flexible enough to adapt to new challenges and opportunities. You must preserve what works while improving what doesn't, satisfy current stakeholders while preparing for future needs, and maintain current systems while building capacity for necessary changes. The most sophisticated practitioners of power maintenance learn to operate on multiple timescales simultaneously. They maintain day-to-day operational effectiveness while building long-term institutional strength. They respond to immediate challenges while positioning themselves for future opportunities. They satisfy current constituencies while cultivating relationships with emerging stakeholders who will become important in changed circumstances. This requires what I call temporal leadership, the ability to balance short-term pressures with long-term strategic thinking without allowing either perspective to completely dominate decision-making. The leader who focuses exclusively on immediate concerns will find their position gradually eroded by those who are thinking further ahead. The leader who focuses only on long-term positioning may lose their power base before their strategic vision can be implemented. Maintaining power also demands understanding how to manage the psychological changes that authority creates in both yourself and those around you. Power changes people in predictable ways, and the wise leader prepares for these changes rather than being surprised by them. Success can create overconfidence, isolation can distort judgment, and the constant pressure of decision-making can lead to decision fatigue that compromises the quality of choices. The established leader must develop what I call power discipline, the ability to remain self-aware and maintain perspective. Despite the natural tendency for authority to create blind spots and inflated self, this requires actively seeking feedback from people who will tell you difficult truths, regularly questioning your own assumptions, and maintaining connections to perspectives outside your immediate sphere of authority. Perhaps most importantly, maintaining power requires accepting that your tenure is temporary and using that acceptance to guide your decisions about legacy and succession. The leader who cannot imagine life after power will make increasingly desperate decisions to preserve their position, often destroying the very things they sought to protect. Those who understand that their role is to advance causes larger than themselves can make choices that strengthen their mission, even when those choices might weaken their personal position. The ultimate success in maintaining power lies not in clinging to authority indefinitely, but in using your time in power so effectively that your influence continues even after your formal authority ends. This requires building institutions, developing successors, and creating momentum for beneficial changes that can outlast your personal involvement. The truly successful leader leaves their organization stronger than they found it and ensures that their departure does not signal the end of their most important work. True power extends beyond the lifespan of those who wield it. I have come to understand that the greatest leaders are not those who accumulate the most authority during their lifetimes, but those who create lasting changes that continue to shape the world long after their deaths. This perspective transforms how one thinks about every decision, every relationship, and every use of temporary authority. The concept of legacy requires understanding the difference between impact and influence. Impact is what you accomplish directly through your own actions during your time in power. Influence is what continues to happen because of the systems you created, the people you developed, and the ideas you propagated. Impact is measured in years or decades. Influence can be measured in centuries. I learned this distinction through studying the contrasting legacies of Julius Caesar and Marcus Aurelius. Caesar achieved enormous impact. He conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, transformed the Roman Republic into an empire, and became one of history's most famous figures. His direct accomplishments were extraordinary by any measure, and his name became synonymous with imperial power. Yet Caesar's influence proved surprisingly limited. The political system he created lasted for centuries, but it bore little resemblance to his personal vision. His successors ignored most of his specific policies, and the empire evolved according to pressures and opportunities he never anticipated. His legacy was more symbolic than substantive. People remembered his fame more than his ideas. Marcus Aurelius achieved less dramatic impact during his lifetime. He was an effective emperor who managed the empire competently during challenging times, but he initiated no great conquests, founded no new institutions, and left no revolutionary changes to Roman governance. By the standards that measure immediate impact, his accomplishments were modest compared to Caesar's. However, Marcus Aurelius's influence has proven far more durable and extensive. His philosophical writings continue to shape how people think about leadership, responsibility, and personal conduct to millennia after his death. His ideas about duty, self-discipline, and service to the common good have influenced countless leaders across cultures and centuries. His intellectual legacy has outlasted the physical empire he served and continues to provide guidance to people facing challenges he could never have imagined. This contrast taught me that lasting influence requires what I call ideological embedding, that your core principles become incorporated into the thinking and institutions of people who will continue your work. This is fundamentally different from creating personal loyalty or dependence, which dies with the leader. Ideological embedding involves teaching others to think in ways that naturally lead them to conclusions and actions that advance your objectives, even when you are not present to direct them. The leader who seeks lasting influence must therefore become an educator as well as a decision-maker. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to model the principles you want others to adopt. Every explanation of your reasoning becomes a chance to teach frameworks that others can apply to new situations. Every mentoring relationship becomes a vehicle for transmitting not just skills, but ways of thinking that will generate appropriate responses to unforeseen challenges. Building lasting influence also requires what I call institutional thinking, systems and processes that embody your principles and continue to operate according to your vision, even when different people occupy positions of authority. The wise leader understands that their personal involvement is temporary, but that well-designed institutions can perpetuate their approach to recurring problems long after their departure. This institutional thinking must extend beyond formal organizational structures to include what I call cultural architecture, the shared assumptions, values, and practices that determine how groups behave when no one is explicitly in charge. Culture often proves more durable than formal rules and policies, because it operates at the level of automatic habits and unconscious assumptions rather than conscious compliance. Creating lasting cultural change requires patience and consistency that many leaders lack. It means repeatedly demonstrating the values you want to embed until they become so associated with success that others adopt them voluntarily. It means consistently rewarding behavior that reflects your principles and consistently discouraging behavior that contradicts them, even when the immediate consequences seem minor. Perhaps most importantly, building lasting influence requires what I call succession planning, not just identifying who will replace you in formal positions, but ensuring that your successors understand and are committed to continuing your most important work. This requires developing people who share your fundamental convictions while possessing the skills necessary to adapt your methods to changing circumstances. The greatest legacy builders understand that their ultimate success lies not in being irreplaceable, but in making themselves unnecessary. They work to create situations where their departure does not signal the end of their mission, but rather its transition to a new phase that no longer requires their personal involvement. This perspective fundamentally changes how one approaches the exercise of power. Every decision must be evaluated not only for its immediate effectiveness, but for its contribution to lasting positive change. Every relationship must be considered not only for its current utility, but for its potential to carry forward important work. Every use of authority must be assessed not only for its short-term results, but for its role in building systems that will continue to serve worthy purposes long after current circumstances have changed. The leader who thinks in terms of legacy finds meaning and motivation that transcends personal ambition and temporary setbacks. They understand that their true measure lies not in what they accomplish for themselves, but in what they make possible for others who will continue their work in times and places they will never see. Now that you understand the secret weapon of adaptability and the principles that govern its effective use, you face the crucial question of how to begin implementing these insights in your own circumstances. The gap between understanding power and wielding it effectively can seem daunting, but remember that every master of these arts began, as you do now, with more questions than answers, more aspirations than achievements, and more potential than proven capability. Your first step must be honest assessment of your current position and resources. Most people overestimate some aspects of their situation while underestimating others, leading to strategies that are either impossibly ambitious or unnecessarily limited. Take inventory of your actual influence, your genuine relationships, your available resources, and your authentic capabilities without the distortion of either false modesty or wishful thinking. Begin with what I call micro-applications, implementations of these principles in low-stakes situations where you can practice and learn without risking major consequences. The administrative assistant who masters strategic communication with difficult colleagues is developing the same skills needed by executives managing billion-dollar negotiations. The team leader who learns to balance individual recognition with collective achievement is practicing techniques that serve presidents and prime ministers. Focus particularly on developing your ability to read situations accurately and respond appropriately, rather than rigidly applying predetermined approaches. The secret weapon of adaptability cannot be reduced to a simple formula because it requires judgment that can only be developed through experience. Start by consciously observing the political dynamics in your current environment. Who really influences decisions? How alliances form and dissolve? What motivates different stakeholders? How information flows through informal networks. Practice the art of strategic patience by identifying one situation where you currently feel pressure to act immediately, and instead invest time in understanding the deeper patterns at work. Most people's political instincts are shaped by emotional reactions rather than strategic thinking. Training yourself to pause, analyze, and respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively will serve you well regardless of how your circumstances evolve. Develop your capacity for what I call principled flexibility, the ability to adjust your methods while maintaining unwavering commitment to your essential objectives. This requires first gaining clarity about what you truly believe is worth achieving, then practicing different approaches to advancing those goals depending on circumstances and opportunities. Begin building your base of support by identifying people whose interests genuinely align with yours and finding ways to advance their objectives while pursuing your own. This is not manipulation, but recognition that sustainable influence requires creating situations where others benefit from your success. Start with small, collaborative victories that demonstrate your reliability and competence before attempting larger initiatives. Most importantly, commit to continuous learning from both success and failure. Every interaction provides information about how power actually works in your environment. Every mistake reveals gaps in your understanding that you can address through study and practice. Every achievement shows you possibilities for greater impact that careful preparation might make accessible. The principles I have shared with you are not merely theoretical concepts, but practical tools that have been tested across centuries of human conflict and cooperation. They work because they are based on accurate observations about human nature and social dynamics, rather than wishful thinking about how we might prefer the world to operate. However, these tools must be wielded with wisdom and restraint. Power is like fire, essential for human flourishing when properly controlled, but destructive when carelessly handled. The techniques that can advance worthy causes can also serve selfish ambitions. The methods that can protect the innocent can also oppress the vulnerable. Your character and judgment will determine whether these capabilities serve the common good or merely your personal interests. Remember that true authority comes not from the ability to compel obedience, but from the capacity to inspire others to willingly contribute their best efforts to shared objectives. The leader who must rely entirely on fear and coercion has already failed, regardless of their temporary success in achieving compliance. Your path forward requires patience with yourself as you develop new capabilities, courage to apply these principles even when they feel uncomfortable or unfamiliar, and wisdom to recognize that mastering the art of power is a lifelong endeavor that offers continuous opportunities for growth and contribution. The world needs leaders who understand how power actually works and who are committed to using that understanding to advance justice, prosperity, and human flourishing. You now possess the knowledge to become such a leader. Whether you develop the character and commitment to use that knowledge wisely will determine not only your own success, but also your contribution to the welfare of all those whose lives you have the opportunity to influence. Begin where you are, use what you have, do what you can. The secret weapon of adaptability is now yours to wield.